Good evening, everyone. My name is Jane Weitzman, and I am a vice president of the JDC board, and I chair the JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to the JDC Archives' second annual Helen Cohen Memorial Lecture, which is endowed by Jerry and Linda Spitzer in memory of Jerry's aunt, his beloved aunt. Jerry is a past chair of our Archives Committee. I want to warmly welcome and thank our co-sponsor, the Jewish Book Council, and I want to especially welcome fellow board members of both the JDC and the Jewish Book Council, of which I just happen to be president. A wonderful organization. I also want to extend a warm welcome to the Portuguese Consul General, Maria de Fatima Mendes, but I have a feeling she's stuck in the elevator. I don't think she's come here. And I just see Sharon Mintz walked in, who is on our Archives Committee, who is the authority on much of the Judaica that is in this exhibition tonight that I hope you'll all go to. The JDC Archives, which houses the records of JDC since our creation over 105 years ago, is one of the most important repositories in the world for the study of modern Jewish history. Scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, filmmakers, family researchers, curators, and others. All of this happens because of the hard work of Linda Levy. Linda, stand up so everybody sees who you are. I know you're embarrassed, but Linda is the professional in charge of our archives, and she has a wonderful and outstanding staff. And would all the staff members stand? I'm not going to name you, all of you, but please stand so we can thank you. You're just terrific. You do a great job. I see you in the back. I would also like to draw your attention to the cards on your seats. We would really appreciate your support for the wonderful work of our archives. You know, JDC has to raise a lot of money to help people in need, but without these archives, so much of our history would be missing. Our speaker, Dr. Marion Kaplan, is a Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History at NYU. She is a 3-time National Jewish Book Award winner for The Making of the Jewish Middle Class, Between Dignity and Despair, and Gender and Jewish History, as well as a finalist for Dominican Haven. Some of us here tonight are judges for the upcoming Jewish Book Awards, and I hope you'll look into attending that at some point. You can go on the Jewish Book Council website, and it's wonderful that we can work with the people who use the archives to create some of these wonderful books. Dr. Kaplan will be addressing us tonight on the topic, Lisbon, Harbor of Hope for Jewish Refugees. Our format will be that our guest speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll entertain questions. Marion?
Thank you for that really nice introduction. And I'm very happy that you all made it, given that it's such crummy weather out there. Only it's going to get crummier, so at least this is not as bad as it could be. All right, and let's hope that I get the PowerPoint halfway decently. Okay. In the opening scene of Casablanca, released in 1942, one of my favorite films, and I bet it's a favorite here too, and one of the 5 most popular films ever, the camera zooms in on a map of Casablanca in relation to Portugal. We learn that the refugees in Casablanca, quote, wait and wait and wait for visas to get to Lisbon. Quote, the great embarkation point for the, quote, freedom of the Americas. Those are the first lines in the film. If you go back, that's what you will hear. We learn, at the end of the film, the heroes fly off to Lisbon. Most Jewish refugees, however, reached Lisbon via far more torturous paths, fleeing through France, Spain, and Portugal, arriving destitute and forlorn. Many of them had already suffered social death, violence, and murder in their homelands. As they realized that their new European host nation didn't really want them either, their situation added one more link to the chain of dehumanization they bore. Therefore, this talk tonight asks, how did Portugal's attitudes and policies impact the lives of Jewish refugees? To respond to this question, we need to answer several more specific questions. How did refugees heading toward Portugal escape Nazi Europe? And how did they fare once they arrived in Lisbon? Why did Portugal open and then try to close its doors? More importantly, how did Jews react emotionally to their frightening odysseys from impending doom to fragile safety, and their fearful wait in an oddly peaceful purgatory? Starting earlier, 33 to 39, the early refugees. Before the war, almost half of German Jews fled their homeland. Many of those seeking asylum from the Nazis went to neighboring countries, especially France and Holland. Even after the brutality of the Austrian annexation in 1938, very few Jewish refugees from Germany or Austria headed toward Portugal. Most did not consider Portugal, a poor agricultural country under another dictatorship, ripe for them. And that's even though Portugal accepted Jews before 38 without a visa. But before 38, not everybody was willing to go to a very strange country. Still, all newcomers, whether Jews or refugees from the Spanish Civil War, alarmed the Portuguese government. In 1936, the secret police worried that, quote, strangers of suspect origin in Portugal might be engaging in, quote, espionage. The police focused on those with, quote, visas made for Russians, Poles, or stateless. They did not single out Jews, although Russians, Poles, and stateless surely included Jews. After the shocking violence toward Jews during Germany's annexation of Austria and the brutality and incarcerations during the November pogrom, some of us call this Kristallnacht or Crystal Night, that same year, German and Austrian Jews tried urgently to flee. However, Nazi bureaucratic and financial roadblocks slowed or blocked emigration. In addition, immigration restrictions in foreign countries stymied those attempting to leave. Quote, every door and portal is firmly locked and bolted, and so is every heart. At the conference at Evian-les-Bains in France in July 38, for example, United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt gathered 32 nations, all of whom, quote, regretted they could not take in more Jews. The organizers had not even invited Portugal. That same fateful year, Portugal began to issue only 30-day tourist visas, barring aliens and Jews from settling in Portugal, to persons who could document that they already had visas. So only if you could pass through and you had a visa to go somewhere else would they let you in. That didn't stop a lot of people, but you'll hear that in a minute. Refugees came. Several hundred arrived between 33 and the fall of France in June 40. Most settled in Lisbon, the capital, and a lively port city of about 600,000 people, where the majority of Portugal's about 2,000 Jews lived. These early refugees brought some money with them to start small businesses or had careers or businesses they could continue with some local help. But then came mass flight in 1940. With the fall of France, huge masses of refugees, not only Jews, fled south. The French police treated them with, quote, a combination of muddle and brutality, sometimes resorting to arbitrary arrests, mass roundups that could end in a concentration camp. The German secret police, the Gestapo, also prowled in Marseille and on the French-Spanish border. Thus, most foreigners wanted to get out of France. Let me see if I can. Yet leaving France proved treacherous, since the French, now cooperating with Germany, refused to give exit visas. Spain's stance on refugees crossing borders also grew increasingly opportunistic and unreliable. Varian Fry of the American Emergency Rescue Committee in Marseille wrote that the Spaniards, quote, opened and closed the frontier again and again, making it, quote, hard to imagine a crueler way of torturing human beings. Portugal demonstrated generosity at first, admitting tens of thousands of transmigrants, with even the slimmest evidence, including visas to China, Belgium, Congo, and Siam, even though the refugees could not read Chinese and reportedly no one could get to Siam. Because of these relatively liberal practices, as well as underground railways and illegal entries, thousands of refugees arrived in Lisbon without proper papers. By July 1940, Lisbon had emerged as the best way station for Jews to escape Europe for North or South America. Between 40,000 and 80,000 people reached Portugal in the year 1940-41. And that's a figure nobody knows. It's like the largest escape hatch westward. The largest escape hatch eastward was Russia, was the Soviet Union, but this is the West. The Germans even allowed Jewish organizations to send some trainloads of Jews in sealed wagons to Portugal in 1940 and 41, often subsidized by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which I will call the Joint from here on in. And in the next few years, human smugglers helped Jews arrive in Portugal with and without papers. And I'm trying to give smugglers a good name because they did amazing work. One mother had hired smugglers to take her 3 children over the Pyrenees soon after the Germans occupied France, southern France. Her forged safe conduct papers got them as far as Barcelona. There, the civil guard discovered and imprisoned them until the Joint freed them about a week later. In 1943, the Joint received several hundred Jewish children sent by the French Jewish resistance to Barcelona. The Joint representative wrote, quote, we were constantly in contact with the Spanish border, and when a group of Jews had crossed the Spanish-French border illegally, we were notified. After the Jewish refugees were kept there a few days, they were freed, we took them to Barcelona. In the fall of 1940, American reporter William Shirer logged in his diary that Lisbon served as, quote, the one remaining port on the continent from which you could get a boat or a plane to New York. The writer, Arthur Koestler, who spent 7 weeks in Lisbon while trying to get to England, referred to the city as the last open gate of a concentration camp. While tens of thousands continued their exodus by boat or plane to distant shores, Lisbon still housed about 8,000 refugees in late 1940, most of whom got to the country with useless visas, and among whom 90% were Jewish. In early 41, about 14,000 Jewish refugees required shelter because they kept coming over the border, so it'd go down, then it'd go up again because people kept flowing in. Thus, Portuguese reluctance and the dizzying visa procedures notwithstanding, Lisbon soon became, quote, the refugee capital of Europe. Let me see if I can. That's one of the beautiful plazas in Lisbon today. At that moment, the Nazis directly or indirectly controlled most of Europe, with the exceptions of Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal. A few weeks later, 3.9 million Nazi troops invaded the Soviet Union. So this is right at that moment where the war is going to expand. Arriving in Portugal, refugees had very positive experiences with individual Portuguese citizens and remained grateful for their kindness. After the fall of France, some arrived with money that could only last a few days. Most arrived, quote, flat broke. One woman on a train heading to Lisbon and obviously starving eyed a young girl eating bread. The Portuguese conductor, observing her, offered her a whole loaf of bread and gave her a place to lie down in first class. Yvette Davidova recalled that having fled Vienna, she and her mother had no more money upon boarding the train from Madrid to Lisbon. They asked the Portuguese ticket collector if he would let them pay in Lisbon and offered a ring as collateral. He insisted he would pay for their fare and their meal in the restaurant car and would give them his address in Lisbon so they could repay him when they had money. That was her first contact with a Portuguese person. When Alma Mahler-Werfel needed to pay her Portuguese hotel bill, the clerk, quote, seemed to sense that it would leave me very short of cash. Never mind paying the bill, he said. I'll advance it for you, and you can send me the money from New York. Others, too, report receiving fruit and flowers upon their arrival from residents of small towns. Consciously or unconsciously aware that Portugal had driven out Jews or forced them to convert in the late 15th century, Jews noticed the lack of anti-Semitism in the Portuguese population. Indeed, a Portuguese-born Jewish man who stayed in Lisbon during the war, assisting refugees, insisted he had never felt anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish attitudes there. Moreover, even when Portugal placed restrictions on immigrants, Jewish newspapers noted that the country still welcomed Jews with capital or businesses. These refugees contrasted the kind-heartedness of the Portuguese people with the rather ruthless behavior they had experienced before they fled Central Europe. Grateful for such kindness, some refugees nevertheless noticed the culture clash apparent at first glance. Portugal was a society of stark inequality and highly visible, quote, indescribable poverty. Women took almost no part in public life, and the society felt, quote, behind the times. Concerned with their own plight, most of these Northern Europeans saw Portugal as an interlude and simply tried to get along in their new surroundings. And the Portuguese themselves proved hospitable to the new customers, tenants, and neighbors. Rare tensions occurred only when refugees tried to peddle or to work, competing with Portuguese trying to earn their own livings. Unlike the generosity and friendliness of Portuguese individuals, however, the government proved far more ambivalent toward refugees. At first, the government appeared to react slowly to the refugees. Its dictator, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, ruled from 1932 until 1968. Portugal proclaimed formal neutrality on September 2, 1939, one day after Hitler attacked Poland. Its hotels, casinos, beaches, and cafes entertained, quote, the wealthy but homeless people from all parts of Europe, including the warring sides who remained for the duration of the war. This included Prince Edward. This included very, very wealthy non-Jews who were also endangered by the Nazis. Poor refugees, like the ones I'm talking about, had to produce transit visas to show they planned to move on within 30 days. Salazar and his minions stressed their, quote, neutrality, hoping to balance the Allies and the Germans for a variety of economic and political reasons, including opportunism and how the war seemed to be going. More specifically, Portugal had an alliance with England dating back to the 14th century, one that the former perceived as protecting its sovereignty against Spain, who had regularly invaded. As significantly, Britain and Portugal maintained centuries-old commercial relationships. Yet the warring sides both eyed Portuguese tungsten, which is called wolfram in German, and so the word wolfram comes up a lot, but it's tungsten, which was needed to harden steel necessary for military production. Britain and Germany demanded more and more of this crucial metal as the war continued. The Germans used threats, bribes, smugglers, but in the end received less tonnage than the Allies. In June 1944, Portugal refused to send tungsten to either side. Furthermore, the Azores provided tension. Both the Allies and the Germans wanted to use these islands, located in the North Atlantic, for both air and navy operations. Portugal negotiated with each side, but leased naval and air bases to the British as of October 43. But remember what October 43 looks like. Germany had already suffered a major defeat at Stalingrad, the Allies had already landed in Sicily, and Mussolini had been deposed. Ultimately, and late, Portugal tipped toward the Allies. On a covert level, both Germany and Britain played roles inside Portugal that could make, and did make, for spy thrillers. The British Secret Service, MI5 and MI6, infiltrated the Portuguese secret police. And the Germans established several German-paid and Portuguese-staffed spy networks. Ian Fleming based his Casino Royale on a trip that he, as a Royal Navy intelligence officer, took in Portugal in 1941. He gambled at the casino in Estoril, aware that spies of the warring sides played there as well. And they all knew each other as well. Everybody knew who the other guy's spy was. Strategic and economic issues certainly influenced Portuguese hesitations regarding refugees, but Portuguese leaders also worried about domestic issues. Some thought that the small country could not absorb huge numbers of immigrants. The Portuguese also saw themselves as a land of emigration, not immigration, losing about 50,000 people a year due to the poor economy. Further, although the refugees provided new consumers and an influx of foreign money from aid organizations to the urban and seaside economies, the Portuguese middle class worried about business competition from Jewish refugees. Most importantly, Salazar and his cronies feared all aliens, Jewish and non-Jewish, as possible liberals and leftists who might destabilize his regime. Significantly, I think this is really important, Salazar did not evince overt anti-Semitism. For him, citizenship meant political and legal status. It was not a racial category. The government treated Jewish refugees of Portuguese nationality differently from those of other nationalities. Portuguese Jews were simply Portuguese. Although Salazar opposed liberals, Republicans, and communists, which could have been interpreted as stand-ins or code words for Jews, he didn't openly discuss Jews nor use terms like Judeo-Bolshevik or world Jewry as other European fascists did. He had come to power in 1932 at a time of virulent anti-Semitism in Europe, without ever using overt anti-Semitic rhetoric. Even Portuguese fascists, they were called the blue shirts, disdained the kind of anti-Semitism rampant in Northern Europe. They admired Hitler, yet they did not oppose Jews coming to Portugal. The police certainly harbored anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic attitudes, but even as they harassed and threatened Jews, we know of very few incidents where the police delivered them to the Germans. There are a few, but very few. Individual Portuguese consuls also came to their aid. Against the desires of the government, Portugal's general consul in Bordeaux, and many of you may have heard of him already, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, wrote out at least 10,000 visas for refugees, both Jewish and non-Jewish, from every part of Europe. De Sousa Mendes also sheltered refugees in his house and issued so many visas that his government sent 2 officials from Lisbon to bring him home. And yet, even if Portugal recalled and punished De Sousa Mendes severely and tightened its restrictions, there were many contradictions. The government decreed in 1940 that Portugal would not become a, quote, dumping ground. And yet refugees continue to enter, quote, with the active or tacit approval of the government. So there's a lot of ambivalence. The majority of refugees, as I said already, came without money. Those with some possessions, rings, silver, or cars, quickly sold them for a pittance. Moreover, those relatives and friends caught in the Nazi trap beseeched the same penniless refugees for help. The Jewish refugees depended on local and international aid organizations, especially Jewish ones. Starting in the summer of 1940, Lisbon ranked second only to Geneva in the amount of Jewish organizational activity. These Jewish organizations, and I've already mentioned the Joint, but I can talk about HIAS, HISAM, World Jewish Congress, and the small Portuguese Jewish relief committees, supported refugees in a spirit of solidarity with Jews in trouble, but also to prevent them from burdening the state. So they're playing a two-way game here. They want to help refugees, but they also don't want the refugees to impose on the state so that the state wants to kick them out. The Joint, founded to alleviate Jewish suffering during World War I, offered financial support to many of the organizations I just mentioned, subsidizing individuals as well as those organizations. The Quakers, Catholic Relief Services, and the Unitarian Service Committee, specializing in those at some risk for their previous political activities, among others, also helped non-Jewish refugees, but sometimes Jews as well. The Quakers cared for Jews who had converted to Christianity. Many of these groups advocated for the refugees with the Portuguese and American governments. All of them, to some extent, provided sustenance and shelter, and also attempted to find visas and ship tickets for refugees, especially to the US. And again, the JDC helped these agencies too. This is Joseph Schwartz, who was the JDC European Director in this era. So a lot of the material I looked at the Joint Archives were from Joseph Schwartz, but from others as well. As people on the ground felt then, and as historians have since verified, the US State Department created a slow and cumbersome process. In part, its leadership feared, quote, fifth columnists, or, quote, Trojan horses, supposed Nazi agents who might sneak into the US among the refugees. This, quote, spy hysteria, as well as anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic sentiments affecting policymakers, bureaucrats, and public opinion led to severe entrance limitations. Unknown to the helping organizations and the refugees, but to his and the United States State Department's lasting disgrace, Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long had signed a memo to State Department officials in June 1940, suggesting ways to obstruct the granting of US visas. Applications slowed down to a crawl, taking over 6 months to process, if at all. In sum, attempts to persuade the US administration and elected representatives to welcome more refugees, quote, ran into the stone wall of anti-Semitism, as well as fears of Trojan horses concealed among the refugees, and depression-induced fear of job competition. Finally, on July 15, 1941, the US closed all consulates in Germany, Italy, and Nazi-occupied lands, meaning all cases waited to be determined in Washington, and that took much, much, much longer. These are people who had their entry number, but the consulates closed. Now I want to describe everyday life of refugees in Portugal, which is best described in one person's words by the pen of Kafka and that of Dostoevsky. Refugees constructed their daily lives by prioritizing the search for shelter and food while engaging in the paper chase for visas and ship tickets. They spent anxious moments at the post office, waiting letters from loved ones or documents for further emigration, pleading with aid organizations, gathering with other refugees. A repetitive schedule of errands demanded time and attention. Reporter Eric Severide observed, quote, daily the same routine, the general delivery window to ask for a letter, the American consulate, the newsstand to speculate on Hitler's next move, and then back to the cafe. This led to feelings of gloom as the refugees, quote, stood in the main square each day watching news bulletins and gathered to console each other. Many families required subsidies for their rent and food. Some families occupied small apartments or had cooking facilities in their their one room or their two rooms. One interviewee remembered many versions of sardine dinners because, quote, that was the main affordable food. And for those without sufficient income or who stayed in rooms where they couldn't cook, reporters could watch them trek up the Lisbon hills at noon to receive a free hot lunch from the Portuguese Jewish community, subsidized by the Joint Distribution Committee. The Peccolis family, having fled Italy, spent long days engaging in the anxious rituals of refugee life, pursuing documents to secure safety. These included papers of all sorts, permission to remain in Portugal, visas to get to another country, and ship tickets. In order to acquire the proper papers, Carla and her husband turned their Lisbon room into an office. While Alex went out, quote, to visit consulates, police commissioners, travel agencies in search of a million things, travel permits, proof of citizenship, money exchange, ship passage, and so on, she, quote, pounded out letters on the typewriter addressed to friends and relatives, especially in New York, with requests that went from a simple testimonial authenticated by a notary to the all-important affidavit that would place the responsibility for our future on the shoulders of whoever signed it. Refugees seeking visas waiting on endless lines wherever they went. For example, Erica Munn, on a short trip to Lisbon from England in the fall of 1940, had to appear at the police office for foreigners. She walked 8 minutes to the end of the line. The line at the American embassy seemed to her to have, quote, no end at all. Arthur Kussler typically visited the British passport office or military attaché each morning, interrupting this routine only to send telegrams to London or New York. As a well-known anti-fascist, he too feared for his life, although he would, quote, happily die for an ideal, but I refuse to perish because of red tape. Aid workers too expressed their frustration that a passport of the, quote, right color would offer hope, but if not of the right color, then the stamps within the passport could make the difference between freedom and prison. While waiting, refugees faced, quote, a jungle of consulates, police stations, and government offices, bureaucratic red tape, loneliness, homesickness, and withering universal indifference. Carla Peccolis summed it up. It would have taken the pen of a Kafka to depict the world of visas in all its surrealistic absurdity, that of a Dostoevsky to render the nightmare of the petitioner's struggle for survival. In the end, the refugees had only one occupation. I'm quoting, waiting, waiting, and waiting. Besides pleading with consuls, most refugees also needed the financial aid and logistical assistance of the aid organizations. Daily interactions with these organizations provided relief and exasperation. The refugees themselves understood that American Jewish organizations offered a lifeline. Hans Saal, for example, wrote that they paid the passage, the hotel or boarding house, the food they ate, the doctors and pharmacies they needed for, quote, the pills for anxiety and sleeplessness. Heisem and JDC also paid for the ship tickets that he bought in a cafe once his visa to the U.S. had arrived. Gratefulness, however, clashed with frustration, similar to the resentment and mistrust that often complicate relations between social welfare organizations and their recipients. Most crucially, the recipients thought the philanthropies moved too slowly and felt bitter about appearing as beggars over and over again. Quote, I do not know how long we will have to stay here. At the moment, we have no transportation, and I will have to hassle with Heisem, which has not gotten nicer with time, wrote philosopher Hannah Arendt. Plus, she added, a true battle rages over places on the ship. Ship tickets could cost about today, the opposite, could cost then about $320 to $500. Today, that $500 would be $8,750. These are people who have no money. That's legitimate. And more on the black market. And if refugees did not acquire the tickets in good time, their visas expired. And they had to start the paper chase all over again. It was like filling in a puzzle and getting it always on the right timing. And that was really, really hard. A well-known black market in ship tickets provided refugees with the coveted tickets, but cheated others. Aboard a ship in October 1940, Franz Werfel, the author, wrote his parents, "This ship is full of fates that far surpass ours in horror. Misfortune is so widespread that one should really not complain." Those lucky enough to find tickets left others behind, the latter waving white handkerchiefs in farewell. It's kind of a German, Austrian habit. You get to the train station, you wave your white hanky goodbye, and I see people still do that now. As I said that, one of the unlucky ones standing at the pier waving protested, "I'm tired of waving," as he reported that the ocean liner Nea Hellas would leave the following day, but without him. As early as 1940, George Warren, executive secretary of the President's Advisory Committee on Political Refugees, announced a, quote, desperate need for finding means of transportation. Historian David Wyman has called the alleged dearth of shipping a fraud. Sufficient shipping existed, I'm quoting him. When the Allies wanted to find ships for non-military projects, they located them. Yet when it was a matter of transporting Jews, ships could almost never be found. By November 43, Breckinridge Long could use this alleged lack of shipping to explain the State Department's disinclination to issue more visas. On the ground, the refugees felt perplexed and frustrated. The entire process of emigration from Lisbon reminded Hannah Arendt of the German children's game Mensch ärger dich nicht, which is like our American board game Sorry. Just as one's pawn nears the goal, someone could bump it back to start. In February 41, the main German Jewish newspaper in the United States, the Aufbau, noted that refugees with U.S. visas had been waiting for months for ship reservations. Quote, "Here one cannot understand why America doesn't send a larger ship here at least once a month." In fact, some of them noticed that there were still tourist ships going to Hawaii, but there weren't ships going to Europe for the refugees. Obstructions like this notwithstanding, by mid-42, so that's a year to 2 years, most had managed to emigrate, and about 8,000 to 800, no, sorry, by mid-42 and about 8,000 refugees still remained. When the refugees finished their visits to these consulates and aid organizations and shipping offices, they spent the rest of their days wandering central Lisbon, where they couldn't help running into each other. Thereafter, they sat in cafes, what I kind of call a diasporic homeland, despite their very different national or ethnic backgrounds, because they had left the landscapes, the urban features, and the knowledge of belonging to their nations behind. They created a public space in those cafes that felt kind of private. The cafe emerged as a new transnational and temporary home. This corner of their new urban landscape offered a setting where one heard more German and French than Portuguese. Some, like the Cafe Palladium on the Rocio, which is a beautiful plaza, seemed, quote, filled with refugees. Central Europeans, the Viennese in particular, had participated in a cafe culture to the point where a joke circulated depicting a well-known stereotype of them. Quote, "The Viennese spend most of their time in a coffee house. The Jews spend all of their time there. It follows that Viennese Jews cannot exist without coffee houses." More seriously, Lisbon cafes, no longer simple sites of sociability, although this might have been a pleasant side effect, offered indispensable locations in which to exchange advice and rumors. The rumors were often called the Refugee Telegraph. And the rumors were about the war and about possible exit visas. One refugee recalled others who congregated in a particular cafe, quote, where everyone came and asked, "What do we do now?" Jan Lustig described the conversations as, quote, "The emigrants sat in cafes with hollow cheeks and rimmed eyes, stick their heads together, and talk, talk. Day and night, day and night. One says with a sigh, visa. Another smiles ironically and bitterly, visa. The third gives a long, excited speech, but one understands only, visa, visa, visa. Conversations circled around various consulates and aid committees to which individuals had appealed. Even en route to Lisbon, one young man learned, quote, the formula for finding where refugees gathered, head for the city, ask directions to the largest coffee house in the center of town, walk in. This liminal world of cafe identities allowed most Jews a semblance of normalcy, a place to remember who they once were and feel recognized by others from their previous worlds. Stretching their cup of coffee for hours, women and men found solace among people in the same situation. One woman recounted that the refugees only slept in their rooms. Otherwise, they spent all their time in the row of coffee shops across from the American embassy. Many faced the same, quote, psychic hell, worrying about family and friends left behind, mourning the loss of their homes, positions, and reputations, fearing the process of starting all over again in a new place with a new language and new rules. Erica Munn described the smoky, densely packed cafe she frequented, where patrons spent their last pennies. Quote, they would rather forego a hot meal or a night in a hotel than miss seeing their comrades who shared the same fate and whom they would surely encounter there. A seder in a cafe could offer a moment of tradition as well. I don't know why there's so many men in that picture. I really don't, because I'm sure, because a lot of the memoirs that I read were also women, but maybe, I don't know, the women weren't cooking. I don't know what they were doing, where they were. But that's an important picture that shows there is still an attempt at tradition. Often enough, people who thought they had lost each other suddenly reconnected in a cafe. Quote, scenes of joy or of tears followed as they realized how sick or transformed their friends looked, and then they exchanged the news. Indeed, a cafe visit could punctuate, but also become a tedious daily routine. Arthur Koestler described cafe patrons in his novel about the refugees in Portugal. And Eric Severide observed, quote, the poor refugees droop over sidewalk cafe tables, munching cold Portuguese beans with their beer. Sometimes the cafes offered more than solace or food. One could now and then acquire a black market boat ticket. Frank Firth, for example, tried to purchase legitimate tickets in late 1940, but knew that, quote, one solution was to go and buy one in a coffee shop. Cafe rumors further provided hints as to which shipping companies had come across an extra ticket or two. The cafes did not provide freedom from danger, however, since refugees suspected that many waiters worked for the state police. Thus, the refugees, also usually speaking in German, nevertheless found it wise to replace the word Portugal and Portuguese with Greece and Greeks, which would attract less attention when their conversations were overheard. On occasion, the police would swoop down on these cafes and arrest individuals who didn't have the right papers. Having left friends and family behind increased refugees' sense of loss and displacement. They still received letters from Eastern and Western Europe through 1941 and had a sense of what their loved ones faced. They certainly understood that hunger stalked loved ones, that many coped with forced labor and cramped housing, and that others confronted impossible bureaucratic hurdles to get out of Europe or out of concentration camps. In Lisbon, they talked about, quote, problems, family, anxiety, what happened to other members of the family, end quote. They followed the war as closely as they could through censored news. With few reliable sources available to them, it's not clear what refugees knew about deportations eastward that commenced in October 41. The same month, Germany closed its borders to emigration. For example, a letter from Berlin to Lisbon in March 42, amidst ongoing deportations to the east, hinted at something. I quote, I was recently fired and you must know what that means. For the time being, I'm heading into an uncertain future, still hoping to, despite it all, that I will see my beloved wife and children again. I'm trying to steady my nerves and retain hope so that I can hang on mentally, emotionally, and physically. Similarly, another letter from a Berlin woman in 42 reports that her son made it to Canada, and that at the moment I am, quote, still at my old job, whereas Ludwig and Greta, also so-and-so, are gone. And that was a hint. Are gone is, they couldn't say deported or transported. Aid workers had access to more information. For example, Fred Mann, who worked for the Lisbon Jewish community, supported by the Joint, had been told about starvation and wanton killing from Dachau. And toward the end of 1940, he heard the Nazis had created a sealed ghetto in Warsaw. He also claimed he learned of mass killings near Vilna in October 41. The Quakers, too, began hearing reports, but only in June and July 42. And 42 is the worst year of the Holocaust. It's the most murderous year of the Holocaust. And the Quakers heard, quote, of awful things happening in France. They also heard rumors of extermination camps, but could not believe the Nazis would, quote, waste their energy and scarce railroad cars on non-military objectives, and recalled the exaggerated propaganda from World War I. In conclusion, the refugees lucky enough to jump the myriad hurdles between their country of origin and the Portuguese coast had suffered enormous physical and mental anguish. En route to Portugal and penniless, many searched for food, shelter, and visas. Thousands of people went through the garbage in Marseille, recalled one such forager, formerly a Viennese haberdasher. Others sat in, quote, hot, dusty, half-freight, half-passenger trains, full of fearful refugees with or without papers. Ambivalently and ambiguously, Portugal, a poor country whose dictatorial government feared foreigners and leftists, offered a relatively safe haven to refugees. Still, Portugal ultimately saved the lives of tens of thousands of Jews who managed to get there. Lisbon emerged as a symbol of temporality and transition as refugees applied for visas and ship tickets, sought friendship and advice in cafes, these meeting places of refugees from all over the world. Many spent most of their time in cafes, applying for visas to go anywhere. That was their desk, that's where they could write. There they shared also news of loved ones gleaned from letters and cards from Germany and German-occupied Europe. Jewish organizations, and especially the Joint, provided this aid to refugees. These groups also interceded with the Portuguese government to assure the safety of refugees and the patience of the government. And whereas refugees often voiced frustration with aid organizations, they ultimately and almost always uniformly praised the Portuguese people, from consuls to individuals. The Portuguese left strong positive impressions with the Jewish sojourners, even if it, quote, wasn't integration, but living together. The few refugees who remained to become immigrants appeared to have both integrated with Portuguese society and maintained their own refugee circles. Daniel Blaufuchs depicted his grandmother's weekly canasta group of refugee ladies in a film. Several of these women had married Portuguese men, learned the language, and integrated into Portuguese daily life. Blaufuchs's grandmother brought up a, quote, Portuguese daughter and 2 Portuguese grandchildren. As they gathered around the table, they spoke German and ate homemade German apple pie. Quote, that canasta table was a country where they found a part of themselves again, their German Jewish culture. Such nostalgia notwithstanding, this family celebrated victory over Germany with its Portuguese neighbors. Outside their home, they could, quote, hear good wishes and shouts, such as long live the Jews. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaplan. That was really incredible. It's just amazing that this happened in Portugal when you think back to Portugal's history of getting rid of Jews. We have very limited time for questions, but we do have about 10 minutes. So would you like, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. And Jeff is here with, right over there, Jeff. Jeff, right there.
Oh, I'm
No, back there.
There's someone here.
I saw hers first.
You can ask your question. There's someone here, Jim.
Irene, you have a question?
Okay, so, hello?
Do you want to go first and then?
Après
Okay.
vous.
Three quick questions. One, what countries did the refugees come from? Most of the refugees came from what countries?
Germany, Austria, and Poland.
And
In
Germany?
that order,
Okay, and how did they get to Portugal, by land or by sea?
by land, over the mountains, or by train. I mentioned that the Nazis actually supported some trains going from Berlin to Lisbon.
And did any of the refugees go to the Portuguese colonies in Africa and Asia?
That's a really interesting question. The answer is no. Salazar was okay with them staying for a while in Portugal. He did not want them in his colonies.
Okay.
That's right. No to Angola. Right. Hi. My name is Leah Sills. I am the daughter of a Sousa Mendes visa recipient. I'm also, beside me, both on my left and on my right, are also the children of visa recipients. And I love remarking that Sousa Mendes, when I go and speak at schools, the Portuguese pronounce him Sousa Mendes.
Right. Right.
So at my first encounter with Portuguese people, I got to introduce them. I got to teach them what a mensch is. So that was thrilling. I guess my question for you as an educator, and we're also surrounded by academics and writers and authors, when you are in your classroom and you're teaching about an upstander or someone who showed such moral courage when he himself died in abject poverty and his family had to scatter around the world, what is your lesson? And even for the youngest students, what do you recommend that everyone tonight, learning what they have learned about Portugal and how they were so welcoming, well, not Salazar, but the Portuguese, what you would recommend that academics do in their classrooms?
That's a very good question, and there's a long answer, but I'll try for the short one. When I teach about Nazi Germany, my students, A, think Germans come from Mars. They're different from us human beings, and I try to explain they're not. And B, I do spend time on upstanders. They are the exception to the rule, but they're so important. If we don't talk about them, then there's no model for students to understand that you can resist tyranny and you can resist, certainly you can resist, let's start at the beginning, but you can resist bullying. And then you can resist teachers who are requiring or being unfair toward other students. And then you could go out into politics and you can go door to door and you can resist whatever tyranny you want to. And you can go to refugee headquarters and you can help kids. So I talk about that a little bit because if you just talk about all the bad guys, there's no lesson. There are bad guys. So I really like the question of upstanders, and I don't think we used to do that. I think we used to just say, okay, all the Germans fell for this, and there were one or two. And now there's a very nice old book, maybe 30 years old, The Last Jews in Berlin. It reads like a novel, but it's actual stories that happened. And each of those Jewish people in each of those chapters wouldn't have survived without upstanders, without people hiding them. So that's the kind of lesson I guess I try to teach.
I was going to ask whether the refugees in Lisbon were aware of the history, because I remember being so very struck in Lisbon by the main square where Jews were burned at the stake, and whether, in fact, there were any echoes or or knowledge, in fact, of the Jewish history of Portugal that influenced in some way the feelings of the refugees who were there.
The question of, did the refugees in Portugal know about the history of Portugal and the Inquisition? The answer is some did and some didn't. I said some consciously and some unconsciously may have known about it. It was not a big theme, except in the Jewish community, which would sometimes comment on that. One of the leaders of the Jewish community said, Portugal today is making up for what happened in the past. So the community leaders certainly knew. Did all the refugees know? That's hard to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaplan. I want to really, I know all of us here are very grateful to you because we learned about something that we didn't know so much about before. I hope you all enjoyed our program today, and I invite you to go to the amazing JDC Archives and see our online exhibits, look at our photo collection, use our names index, maybe to trace your own family history, and research on our online text collections. I'd also like to invite you to look at the Jewish Book Council website. It's almost brand new. And we finally got it up there. And if you want to read more books, if you want to read about Dr. Kaplan's books, there's so much you can find on there. So I invite you to do that. I want to extend our gratitude again to Linda and Jerry Spitzer for endowing the Helen Cohen Memorial Lecture and enabling us to sponsor today's lecture. I want to thank the JDC Archives committee members